Language is crucial to understanding societies. It's crucial to recognising the ecological, social, political and economic conditions in which we live. We use language to frame problems, formulate solutions, to negotiate and communicate political and economic pitfalls. Language is interaction that can accelerate action. But language is also performance, and performances can be used to distract from inaction, to avoid action, or postpone action, as much as to accelerate it. And language is what we focus on in this second series of our Language and Power podcast.
Hi, Tom.
Hi, Michael. How are you doing?
Good, thanks. Yeah, so we're today going back to the Partygate scandal. This time we're going to be looking at, in more detail, at the Gray report or the interim findings. So we're still, as we record, we're still awaiting the official report from Sue Gray on Partygate. But what we do have at the moment, and what we're going to talk about today, is the investigation update. So this was published back at the end of January 2022 as an interim findings. Interim because the Metropolitan Police were also investigating this matter. So let me just remind everybody what Partygate is all about. So I'm just going to very, very quickly read the first paragraph. There's a whole page on Partygate on Wikipedia, so I'm just going to read the first paragraph. So it tells us that Partygate is a political scandal in the United Kingdom regarding parties and other gatherings of government and Conservative Party staff held during the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 and 2021, when public health restrictions prohibited most gatherings. While several lockdowns in the country were in place, gatherings took place at 10 Downing Street, its garden, and other government buildings. These were first reported on from late November 2021 and attracted media attention, public backlash, and political controversy. In late January 2022, 12 gatherings came under investigation by the Metropolitan Police, including at least 3 attended by Prime Minister Boris Johnson. So as we record, we don't know the outcome of the Metropolitan Police investigation. We haven't had the full Sue Gray report. We have got this interim report. We've done a previous episode on some of the reporting and the discourse of Boris Johnson, his framing of the parties and Partygate. But today we're talking about this interim report.
Yeah, the really interesting hearing you give that blurb from Wikipedia, which we've used purposely to be neutral, but it made me think just hearing the language, the way it's got to be neutral as a Wikipedia policy, POV, which means that things have to be neutral and you'll get edited out if they're not. But there's ways of getting ideas in there that isn't 100% neutral. And it struck me for a couple of reasons. One is that I had a wonderful PhD student, Birant Sudu, who was looking at coverage of newspaper of a civil servant strike in Botswana, where there is a legal requirement to be objective. But she was very interested in how you can get a lot of subjective voice into it by smuggling it in under the guise of objectivity. And I was just hearing a lot of those features there. But also in the Gray report, it's the same thing. There is a legal requirement for Gray to be objective in her findings. But this document is laden with evaluative language. It just depends where you put it and how you say it. And it's this way of getting in a strong opinion while still fulfilling the generic requirements we talked about, Sean, previously, the generic requirements to be an objective reporter. And just on those grounds, you talked about the fact that the Metropolitan Police report wasn't out yet, and that constrained Sue Gray in many ways. And she makes a point of that. She says, I can't do certain things. And because of that, a lot of people expected this report to be quite bland. But it's not. It's actually pretty explosive if you know if you to certain audiences. I think some people might find it a little bit bland, and some people did say it doesn't say anything and it's very grey. It's far from grey. Sue Gray is far from grey. It reminds me of a personal reaction I had when I saw, it turns out to be 30 years ago, Geoffrey Howe making a speech to Parliament in which he criticised Margaret Thatcher, and I saw it and I thought, oh, well, he's done nothing. That's absolutely ridiculous. He's totally bland and done nothing. But it actually, for those who knew what to look out for, and were comparing it with the expectations of parliamentary speeches, It was absolutely stunning. And I'm looking to, there's a report in The Guardian from November last year that says, how's that the day a dead sheep turned into a roaring lion? Now, a couple of things there. Dennis Healey, the very prominent Labour Party minister at the time, referred to being in an argument with Geoffrey House being like savaged by a dead sheep, as like being savaged by a dead sheep. This speech that I saw as very, very bland is now being described as, you know, delivers his fateful speech, a speech that destroyed Margaret Thatcher's career single-handedly. So a roaring lion. So
when was that, Tom? Was that 1989? Was that or 1990, wasn't it?
It did say 30 years ago in that report, which I've just clicked off my screen. So November 89, it must 90, it must have been November 90, yeah. And I remember seeing it and thinking it was nothing. And I think this is the same with the Sue Gray report, that to a lot of people it might look very bland, but it's not, because of what the expectations against which it is framed. Of course, we won't know for a while how damning it is, because there's been an interlude in Partygate at the moment.
Yes, we were talking about the Ukraine situation, so which we've also done an episode on, and that's left this Partygate thing on the back burner in terms of media in the UK anyway, as we record. But this could explode any moment. So this interim report, it is, just to give us sort of a detail. We put a link in the description, but it is a 12-page document. It's all text. It's in sections. Each of the paragraphs in kind of legal fashion are numbered, so we can talk about those. But there's no and there's a coat of arms at the beginning, because it's from the Cabinet Office. So there's a Cabinet Office coat of arms logo, I guess you might call it. The very plain title, and other than that, it's just very, very plain, straightforward text. Do you want to? So it's in 4 sections.
Yeah.
Sort of preamble where some of the situation is described. The first paragraph says, on the 8th of December 2021, the Prime Minister asked the Cabinet Secretary to carry out an investigation into allegations reported on in the media relating to gatherings in number 10 Downing Street. So it's just kind of setting out I suppose the terms of reference and some of the evidence that's been submitted. There's a next section on methodology, which is a couple of pages long, and then a context section, followed by a general findings section, and then a final section, a very short paragraph on conclusion. So I think you wanted to go through those one by one, some perhaps more interesting to us than others, but...
Yeah, they're all interesting in their own way, and I think it's this idea about the generic requirements. I mean, it is set out in a particular way, and the language changes, and there are different affordances, what we can do, or what Sue Gray can do in the different sections. And in the first one, it's not called preamble, but it more or less, I think it'd be called a preamble in another document. As you say, it sets out the terms of reference to the report and gives background details in very technical ways. I think this is interesting way, just because that discussion we had about Partygate, where the term gathering had taken on this strange meaning of so 2 or more people together. And that was at one stage not necessarily illegal, but it was like what we might call the entry condition if you're talking about flow charts or systems. Nothing would have been illegal until it was a gathering, but a gathering isn't necessarily illegal. So that's the initial requirement for investigation. But we see again and again. So in section 5, Sue Gray talks about the following events. Okay. So the first one says showing a number of groups, then we get a gathering in the garden of number of 10, a gathering in the Cabinet Office, a gathering in the Cabinet Room. So again, we have this term gathering, and then there's a lot of extra information on the Prime Minister's birthday, on the departure of the number 10 Private Secretary. So it's what we talked about before. You've got this term gathering, which is potentially damning, or potentially not, and then some extra information. It's that extra information which is put in the form of a qualifier after the noun. Is that relevant or not? Does it change the nature of a gathering to a party, to an office, to whatever? So it's left up there. So it sort of reiterates that point we were making earlier about the gathering plus qualifier, while it's still got to be determined if it's actually changed class. Is it moved into the class of illegality? So I thought that was nice in section 1. In section 2, I didn't see very much of interest, apart from the fact that point 9, Sue Gray makes it very clear that she's not allowed to report on illegality. That's the Metropolitan Police's job. So that's important that she puts that. But she also makes it clear that she still thinks it's worth making these points. There's
Yeah.
still stuff to
Yeah.
stay here. So she's
Yeah.
setting expectations. And again, if we think about what the document means, it's in comparison with the expectations of the constraints of that document. So if you make it very clear that you can't do certain things, what you do say becomes much more important, in just the same way that Howe's speech was much more effective than I thought it would be, because of what we're
Yeah.
comparing it with.
Yeah. I think in this, so we're on the methodology section, aren't we
Yeah.
now? And I thought number 10 was actually worth just
All
pointing
right.
out. So she this is where she tells us the Metropolitan Police has now confirmed that as a result of information provided by the Cabinet Office investigation team, so that's her team. So she's given information to the Metropolitan Police, as well as the assessments made by Metropolitan Police officers. They are investigating the events on the dates set out above. So she's given a set of dates above, with the exception of, now she says, and then she gives list four gatherings which are not going to be investigated by the police. So these ones on the 15th of May, 27th of November, 10th of December, 15th of December haven't met the requirement that the Metropolitan, whatever criteria the Metropolitan Police are using for investigation. But she is telling us that the Metropolitan Police are now investigating this, which at the time was a big deal. And so it was one of the points of scandal or controversy at the time, wasn't it? As to, well, why aren't the Metropolitan Police investigating this? So that's where she's telling them, right, we've given them information and now they are investigating many of those same things.
There was a lot of scandal, as you say, and there was a lot of I don't know if you saw some of the memes comparing the situation with the very popular British television program Line of Duty, which investigates police corruption. So I believe they got the original actors, if not people imitating their voices, to act out Cressida Dick, the head of the Metropolitan Police, and Boris Johnson is really showing what the police should act like, rather than how they had actually acted in their imagination. Yeah, it was good. It was a very important point.
Well, I mean, and again, another piece of context: the commissioner, in other words, the leader of the Metropolitan Police. The Metropolitan Police is the police service in London, in Greater London, and the head of that police organisation, Cressida Dick, at the time, has now resigned.
Yes, of course.
She resigned because, as a result of many of these, this was a string of perceived failings, shall we say, and this was one of them. It wasn't the final straw, but this was part of that mix, wasn't it?
Yep. So the whole, as you say, the whole role of the police, really important in different ways here, and the fact that it did sort of put constraints on this, but at the same time, the fact that the parties are being investigated is still interesting. Loads of stuff there.
I think there's one other point, just to sort of round that off. In 14, at the end of that, they say, unfortunately, this is Sue Grayson, unfortunately, this necessarily means that I'm extremely limited. This is what you were saying, Tom. I'm extremely limited in what I can say about those events, and it's not possible to present at present to provide a meaningful report setting out and analysing the extensive factual information I have been able to gather. Now, I think that's really interesting, because she's, as you just said, she's telling you, I can't tell you the whole story, but by saying, so it's got this objectivity, but she's saying, I've got a bigger story here than I'm setting out here. There's more, and that extensive factual information. This isn't just that she's got a lot of, not just that she has factual information. She's got extensive factual information.
I think there's an implicature here, isn't there?
It certainly is. Yes. Well, let's talk about that. We've spoken about implicature before. She's giving more information than you might ordinarily expect in qualifying it as extensive. We don't necessarily need to know how much she's got, but by saying that she's got extensive factual information, she's drawn attention to the fact implicitly that there's a lot more to come. And whatever you read into this interim report, it's not the end by any means.
And then, yes, and an assumption that it might be juicy and telling the rest of the information as well.
It does,
related to
right.
criminality as well. Yeah. No, nice. I mean, I just try to imagine a more informal version of this. Well, I can't tell you everything, but
yes. Oh, but also, that choice of the word factual as well. It's not just. I mean, information. Is it always factual? I mean, you would imagine that information is sort of equivalent to facts, isn't it?
Should
Not
be.
always, I guess, but she's factual information. Yeah, so she's really really ramming home that this is indisputable. What she's found is not a matter of opinion or of interpretation. She's got extensive. She's got factual information, and it's extensive. So
And I think that there's an interplay of what's personal information and what's factual information, and it's going to come up a bit in the conclusions as well. So I think that there is a lot of this, what counts as facts, what counts as personal, and navigating between those. And as you say, so that really sets us up nicely for that.
mm,
Yeah, and having done that, I think we can maybe go on to the next section,
yeah,
which is the context. So again, it's not the background that was put out very factually. It's not setting what the remit is. It's not giving the dates to the parties, and it's not talking about the findings, which are all got to be hard fact. Context leaves this. Allows a bit of room for interpretation. What's the context to anything? We'd never know exactly what causes something to happen, so we're allowed to be, when we're moving towards our own interpretation of the context at this stage, and that allows a lot of stuff going on. And this gets me back to the point about the expectations of the document compared with other legal documents. The shock value of the document is not in what it says itself, but what it says in comparison to other documents of this nature, just the same as Geoffrey Howe's speeches had shock value in comparison with other speeches in the Houses of Parliament, not in comparison with speeches in the Sun, articles in the Sun or the Daily Mail or the Guardian. And I think we've mentioned before this idea of Saussure's idea of, words get their meaning in contrast to other words, actions get their meaning in contrast to other actions, not just in their own terms. And I want to bring this point up twice, because this document gets its meaning in contrast to other documents and expectations, but so also does Boris Johnson's behaviour or not. It's not what he did, it's how that contrasts with other people's behaviour, and that's what's got people's goats, that's what got people rattled. At the moment, a lot of the Tory politicians said, well, is it really important if he had a birthday cake or not on his birthday? It's not the fact itself, it's not the act itself, it's how that contrasts with other things. And throughout this, Sue Gray sets up the context, starts off about the outbreak of SARS, and everyone was required to behave in such a way that's set down there, and in line with those rules, the vast majority of the population did this. Then she gives the sort of possible way out for the government, saying that, well, they were working very hard, and also the fact that Downing Street is at once a residence but also part of parliamentary or government buildings makes life difficult. And then comes the killer. Paragraph 22. Those challenges, however, also applied to key and frontline workers across the country who were working under equally, if not more demanding conditions, often at risk to their own health. It is important to remember the stringency of the public health regulations in force in England over the relevant periods, and that criminal sanctions were applied to many found to be in breach of them. The hardship under which citizens across the country worked, lived, and sadly even died while observing the government's regulations and guidance rigorously are known only too well. Wow. So that is a killer paragraph. Yeah, you might have been having difficult times, but so was everybody else, and they lived
more.
and died under them, and you partied. So I think that's the killer paragraph to me. And it's put in very lot of evaluative language. Dying, sanctions, challenges, demanding conditions, risk to their own health. She's managed to get an awful lot of subjective language in there in what is, elsewhere a very neutral report. So that's a real explosion of a paragraph.
Yeah. I mean, I would, I wouldn't see died as an evaluation. I mean, it's that's factual, isn't it? They died. I think the sadly even died. The picture that conjures up for me is all of those people who were saying, I couldn't see my relative who was about to die. We knew they were about to die, and we couldn't go and see them and say either goodbye or give them a hug or anything like that. So without saying that, there is a lot of those, evaluative.
Maybe it's
emotive,
more, even though it's
emotive,
fact, it can be
yes.
emotive, yeah.
Yes, emotive. It's a very emotive, but even that the absence of what we know to have happened is, she's not over exaggerating either, which I think is very smart, isn't it?
Well, it's really
Yeah.
well done, and it's yeah. I mean, and as we've seen those cases you point out where we had lots of people on YouTube and Facebook and stuff like that, but also several times in the House of Commons,
Yeah,
politicians from both sides, or sorry, all three sides, all four sides of the divide, standing up and saying, I couldn't see
that's true. Yeah.
my mother before she died. I couldn't go to this funeral. I remember Tory politicians as well as Labour politicians doing this
Mm, mm,
and saying, and while they were doing that, and it's this idea of contrast coming from the other way. They're saying, I accepted that behaviour and I put up with it. I put up with these privations because I thought everyone was doing it.
mm,
And now I see that it was in contrast to your behaviour. It makes me feel like that sacrifice was not worthwhile.
mm,
Why did I bother doing it?
mm.
And so we've got this double contrast of the public getting scandalised and really, seeing their own behaviour anew, at the same time as setting up the behaviour here as the absolute opposite of this good behaviour. Yeah. Yeah, I know. I was always been very struck with those. I found them very emotional when I've seen those
Yeah,
people
yeah,
speaking in Parliament.
yeah. Yeah, well, another thing that this does is undermines the kinds of defence that were being heard about in the sidelines. We were at the centre of government. I mean, I'm very much paraphrasing here, but we were at the centre of government, and so it was very hard. We were dealing with this pandemic, and so there was a lot of pressure, working closely together under this intense pressure. The nation depending on our decisions and so on. Of course, it was fine. We needed to let off a bit of steam. So, of course, I'm
Yeah, yeah.
paraphrasing, but that was the sort
No,
of thing that
definitely.
I'm saying. And she's completely got to completely undermined that kind of defense. We're saying, well, yeah, you were working hard, but so were a lot of other people who were actually working harder in more difficult conditions. And you saw the pictures of, I don't know if you saw them, but there were quite a lot of pictures of medical staff at
Yes.
the end of their shift, taking off their masks and having deep red lines across the face, looking very, very tired, absolutely exhausted, going off for a few hours rest before then having to come back and do it again. The physical toll of wearing that PPE equipment, as we've now all come to
Yeah.
know the vocabulary of that, but then also the emotional difficulty of actually being with a lot of people who were going to die or had died during their shift, and knowing that it was going to be the same the next day and the next day and the next day into
And
the foreseeable future.
and they
Yeah,
weren't getting glasses of champagne in their downtime.
yeah, yeah.
No, it's yeah, absolutely. And I'm just seeing again the last line of that paragraph with a bit of putting in extra information, like you say, about the implicatures. So the hardship under which citizens across the country worked, lived, and sadly even died, while observing the government's regulation and guidance rigorously. There's a bit more than strictly necessary there. We've already been
Mm,
told about all the guidance and everything, but she says,
mm,
while observing the government's
yeah,
regulations and guidance, this
yeah,
is your, that's thrown in as a little extra bit there
yeah,
to say,
yeah,
your guidance.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
No, it's contrast amazing there.
mm,
Yeah, so I think, that
yeah,
just that bit where she's allowed to be a bit more emotive, allowed to bring in more, more personal language in a way, uh, then
mm,
makes the drier findings, the stuff that she's really got to do generically. There are absolute ways you can phrase your findings, and you've got to be very careful about what you say here. But these now mean something totally
mm,
different because of how she set up the background.
yeah,
You know,
yeah,
they're
yeah,
very much more meaningful than they would have been without that context.
yeah, yeah. So that takes us on to the general findings section. So, the first one, against the backdrop of the pandemic, when the government was asking citizens to accept far-reaching restrictions on their lives, some of the behaviour surrounding these gatherings is difficult to justify.
I love that phrase. It's difficult to justify.
Mm, mm.
By
Yes.
whom?
Well, yes. Yeah. Yeah. But so again, in critical discourse analysis, you often see people interpreting the absence of social actors
Yeah.
or passive agent deletion, saying things that people have done, but not saying who that person is as almost always being a negative thing. I don't think that's true.
Yeah,
It's got to depend on the context, hasn't it?
absolutely.
And
Yeah.
on what's actually been said. In this case, I think it's clever because in the context of the Metropolitan Police investigation and not wanting to undermine that investigation and not wanting to cast judgment on this, just showing this is the fact. You be the judge of it, public, government, whoever else it might be. So the passive agent deletion here, it means that she can tell us what's happened without treading on the toes of the Metropolitan Police investigation. And so in that sense, I think it's a very clever use of absence.
Absolutely. So it's sort of saying the Metropolitan Police might not be able to justify this, but it's not putting them in it. No, it's nice.
Yeah.
But also, what about justify? I think this is nice and vague because, okay, you justify. We're not saying who's justifying. What value system are we using to justify this? Well, there's the legal stuff, and the police have to do that, and they might or might not justify it by the law. But it's difficult to justify by other systems as well, by other value systems as well. And meaning, it's not just about the law. There's other people, bringing in our personal value systems. If you get away with it from the law, it's still difficult to justify by our own values. So it's a nice phrase that it's a real understatement. Oh, his behavior was difficult to justify.
Difficult to justify. Yeah. I like the next one. I mean, I don't think we probably need to go into all of them, but the next one, at least some of the gatherings in question represent a serious failure to observe not just the high standards expected of those working at the heart of government, but also the standards expected of the entire British population at the time. So you really, really, I think this is a theme, isn't it? Contrasting the government with the British population, high expectations, not met, serious versus serious failure. So that's interesting. But again, you have an absence of the agents. So she's not naming those people. So what we've got is, we don't know who's at the gatherings in this paragraph. A serious failure to observe not just the high standards so expected, that's good because it's as though there's a general principle. It's not my expectations. It's not the expectations of fellow party members or a small group of elite people. It's just the general expectation, which gives it a big weight, doesn't it? And those working at the heart of government. Now that's interesting because there's your social actor, those working at the heart of government, but it's broad enough to not be pointing the figure specific into, not naming specific individuals. So she's not treading on the toes of the Metropolitan Police, but at the same time, the heart of government is got a very specific implication, hasn't it? It's those people working very closely, Johnson and those people around him.
Yeah, so that's, I love that. And if you think how buried that is within there, you say there's not saying anyone failed to observe these things. It's saying there was a serious failure. So we use this noun failure to avoid saying the agent. To observe the high standards expected. We're not even told who expects them of those people. So there's an expectation of these people. Those expectations weren't observed, but it doesn't just say, people in government didn't do what they didn't observe these restrictions. It's really buried in a chain of nouns there. But also then at some, there's other ways of modalizing is when we say something might have happened, could have happened, should have happened. We're not saying it's definite. We're sort of putting some doubt in there. And you can do that in many different ways. And there's a lot of variety in this section. But then again, at least some of them. So we're not saying everybody did. We're saying some, but we don't know which ones. And, things are expected. That's again a form of modality. We don't know. This is the way people should behave. This is, it's telling them about the right way to behave. But it's expected. Exactly as you said, it's out there. It's sort of like a general category. It's not saying my personal opinion about what they have to do or should do, but this is what's expected generally. It's presenting it as an objective fact, as you say, or as a commonly shared opinion. And one of the things, if you notice the way that Sue Gray changes the modality in terms of what is likely, what is possibly true, but also what should happen and what must happen, two different types of modality. There's a lot of different stuff. We find that she uses the more personal stuff, which is when you use modal verbs, should, must, and could. She does that a few times. she does it to refer to sort of ideal situations. No member of staff should feel unable to report or challenge poor conduct. There should be easier ways to do this. So she generally does that, but she also brings it into the recommendations. It's obviously it's her job to recommend stuff. So at the very end, she says these events at the conclusion. So I'm jumping ahead to the conclusion,
Yeah,
which says
yeah.
these events must be addressed. She's got the authority to say must. I couldn't say that. I could say the government should do it. They ought to, but not must. So there's personal stuff by that. This should be addressed as a matter of policy in the section just before the conclusions. But so she's saying this is my personal opinion. We're allowed to say it, but then in other places, she's introducing this idea that you say some things are a matter of fact. There was too little thought. It was just out
Yeah.
there. This isn't a matter of opinion. It is not appropriate. Not that I don't think they should do it or I'm forbidding them to do it. It is not appropriate. It's putting it as a matter of fact. So there's some nice mixing of the way. I mean, it's those of you who want to do a PhD on this particular text, there's loads of stuff there. The way she moves in about saying this is my opinion, what I'm entitled to say is my personal opinion, and then there's other stuff that she's talking about, just its common sense
Yes.
about what
Yeah.
people should do and have to do. And it's really lovely all the way through the document, depending on the generic constraints, what she's got to try and she can get her evaluative language in there as if it was common sense, and then she's allowed to say personally what she thinks, what she almost demands is done because she's allowed to do that.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Did you want anything else on the conclusion, the findings? Because I think we could have a closer look at the conclusions if you've got.
Yeah,
anything.
absolutely. Go on.
Yeah. So I mean, it's a short paragraph, so I shall read it out, and then we can pick some parts out. To the conclusion, paragraph 24: the gatherings within the scope of this investigation are spread over a 20-month period, a period that has been unique in recent times in terms of the complexity and breadth of the demands on public servants and indeed the general public. The whole of the country rose to the challenge. Ministers, special advisors, and the civil service, of which I am proud to be a part, were a key and dedicated part of that national effort.
The
However,
next word's a big word here.
Yeah.
You know when people say, I'm waiting for a but.
However, there we go. However, as I have noted, a number of these gatherings should not have been allowed to take place or to develop in the way that they did. There is significant learning to be drawn from these events, which must be addressed immediately across government. This does not need to wait for the police investigations to be concluded.
It's a little masterpiece, isn't it?
So, I mean, go on. Do you want to kick off or pick off?
Okay, just when you're reading that, I mean, I love the conclusion. There is significant learning to be drawn from these events, which must be addressed immediately across government. A nice mixture of her own opinion. It must be addressed. This is my finding. I'm allowed to say that, so you've got to take it seriously now. But this does not need to wait for the police investigations. She knows she's not allowed to say anything about the legality, so that's not the judgment. However, there is significant learning to be addressed.
Learning, yeah.
What does that know? That means she can't say they were doing wrong, but if you've got to learn from something that needs to be addressed, it sort of implies things are going wrong.
Yeah. It does. And I think what we've been seeing throughout is that, this is just this whole thing is just a prelude. You know, we're waiting for those extensive facts that she's promised, and we're waiting to know what are the events. Because this is the second time she said this. She's used this phrase that there are events that should not have been allowed to take place or develop in the way that they did.
Yes, exactly the same phrase again, isn't it?
Exact same phrase that we saw in just a minute ago. And we want to know what they are. She's not told us what those specific and what in what way they developed. So we're waiting. So there's this whole thing is full of implication. It's foreshadowing something else, isn't it? And it's by no means a conclusion. So people trying to draw a line on this, as they say, are not going to be successful because there's a lot more to come. Yeah.
And I love the last line because, as you say, wait for the Soubry report was the concentrate. I believe rather like, the Prime Minister likes to have key responses when he's asked a lot of questions. And I believe, I'm afraid you'll just have to wait until the full report is out, was his answer to everything. It was just what he said to avoid the question. Opting out, crisis maxim, opting out. He used it as a way of opting out. So this is the punchline is not that bad things were done, but these need to be and this does not need to wait for the police report. you can actually start acting now. And so that whole defense has been invalidated by that last line. Again, it's another killer paragraph.
Yeah. Yeah. And yet, as we speak, very, very little change. We are waiting for this to see what really happens. But I think, yeah, I mean, if we can use, so what have we got for our discourse analysis? I mean, a lot of this is about the form, and the use, as we said earlier, the use of the generic, the structure of this genre of document in a very effective way.
Yeah.
The fact that it's very plain, as we've said in another episode, the plain text gives it gravity, or allows it to retain a kind of gravity. But as you've been pointing out, Tom, we've also the modality here. So the attitude towards certainty or distance or uncertainty and an opinion, all of that system that we call modality is really important here. And again, focusing in, focusing out, and using certainty at some points. I mean, I don't know if that's from our point of view as people who.
Yeah, I mean, this is we assume these things work, and we've got to be careful as as discourse analysts, where there's criticisms that this is our interpretation, but we do look to see how these things play out in the long run, and I think but the only way to test it is to see how it went down and what the reactions were in the real world.
Yeah, that's a good point, a good conclusion, I think. Well, there we go. Let's see
what happens.
Let's see what happens with this. We've read the discursive tea leaves, and we think we might know, but we'll see. Okay, right, Tom, that was great. Thanks very much as usual.
Okay, enjoyed it as usual. See you next week. Cheers, Michael.